You walk into an exam room, right? You wait a minute or two and the doctor enters.
Yes, standard routine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they don't look at you right away. They look at the chart, they sit down, and they say, it looks like we've been dealing with this for a while now. And then they look up and ask, what are we hoping to accomplish today?
And it feels completely standard, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
if you were the patient in that room, your brain wouldn't register any sort of, confrontation or manipulation. You just start listing your symptoms.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't blink twice. But our source material today, this really fascinating breakdown on the architecture of frame control, it basically argues that in those specific 10 seconds, your entire psychology was dismantled.
And completely rebuilt.
Right, rebuilt without your conscious permission.
Because it really was. I mean, you walked into that clinic as an independent person, right? You have a physical body and a personal concern. But 10 seconds later, you were neurologically transformed into a collaborative patient.
A patient managing a mutual problem.
Yeah, with very limited, pre-approved objectives. The doctor constructed a psychological frame, placed it in the room, and you just stepped right into it.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today's mission is to decode this hidden architecture of our everyday conversations. We're going to explore how specific, deliberate sequences of statements and questions can, subtly dictate the outcome of literally any interaction. Okay, let's unpack this. Because if a doctor managed to quietly hijack my entire perception of reality in 2 sentences, I really need to know the exact biological and psychological mechanics of how that happened.
Well, to understand those mechanics, we first had to tear down a massive, deeply ingrained myth about who actually holds power in a room.
Okay.
It's a myth perpetuated by, honestly, almost every leadership seminar, networking event, and sales book out there. You have undoubtedly heard the advice, ask better questions. The person asking the questions controls the conversation.
Oh, 100%. That is the golden rule of practically every corporate retreat I've ever attended. You ask the questions, you hold the power because you're the one directing the flow of information.
Right. And according to the behavioral profiling experts behind our source material, that is unequivocally wrong.
Wait, really? Completely wrong.
Totally wrong. A question asked all by itself is what they call a naked question. And a naked question holds zero real power because it operates entirely inside whatever frame is already running in the room.
Ah, I see.
And usually that existing frame belongs to someone else.
Well, I need to push back on that a little bit. Aren't questions inherently powerful because they, psychologically demand a response? If I ask you something, your brain is biologically wired to answer. That feels like a form of control.
It's participation, but we really shouldn't confuse participation with control. Let's look at the underlying mechanics in a corporate environment, for instance. Imagine you walk up to a senior VP in your company and you ask, what's the priority on this project going forward?
Okay, that seems like a normal question.
It is a great, clear, necessary question. But did you take control of that interaction? No. By asking a naked question, you simply reinforced the existing frame.
Which is that the VP holds the authority to decide the priority.
Exactly. And you are positioned below them, requesting an answer. You didn't change the dynamic at all, you just cemented it.
Oh, wow, I see the distinction now. It's kind of like sitting down to play a board game, but you're playing on someone else's board, entirely by their rules. You're participating in the game, sure, and you might even be making moves.
But you definitely aren't the one in control of the underlying mechanics or the win conditions.
Right.
That is a perfect analogy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, to truly have influence, you must set the board before you roll the dice. You can't just throw a naked question into the void and expect it to magically alter the power dynamics.
So if you're a lawyer and you ask opposing counsel, what would it take to settle this before trial? You haven't taken control.
Not at all. You've just shown your hand from a position of weakness and basically invited them to dictate the terms.
Okay, so if naked questions surrender power, how exactly do we set the board? How do we build the frame before we ask the question?
You do it with a statement. A carefully chosen statement must always precede the question. The statement builds the frame, and the question is just the mechanism that forces the other person to step inside it.
Okay, statement first, then question.
Right. The source material outlines 5 specific classes of statements, and each one is paired with a specific type of question. To really see how this architecture works, let's track a single difficult interaction from start to finish.
Let's do it.
Our source material uses this really great example of a chimney sweep who's trying to sell a homeowner on a necessary but very expensive chimney repair.
Oof, that's a tough sales process. The homeowner is likely defensive, probably anticipating a sales pitch and already protecting their wallet.
Exactly. The homeowner's existing frame is highly resistant. So the sweep can't just throw out a naked question like, do you want to fix the masonry?
Right, because that just invites a no.
Yeah, they have to start by setting the board. And the first and most foundational tool for this is a pacing statement. This just describes an observably true reality.
Okay, so just stating the facts on the ground. But why does stating the obvious help shift a defensive mindset?
Because of how the brain processes cognitive load. When the sweep says something undeniable like, it's an older house and masonry naturally shifts and cracks over time, the homeowner's brain registers a subconscious microagreement.
A microagreement.
Yeah. The brain's threat detection system, the critical faculty, temporarily disengages because there is simply nothing to fight. You are just stating a shared reality.
Ah, okay. And once that microagreement happens and the threat level drops, you pair it with a question. The text pairs pacing with a directional question.
Right. A directional question points toward a conclusion without actually stating it outright. That way the other person owns the answer. So the sweep asks, what happens to the roofline if this structural cracking continues through another freezing winter?
Wow, the psychology of self-persuasion. You don't tell them the roof will collapse, you make them picture it themselves.
Exactly.
But what if the facts aren't enough? Like, let's say the homeowner agrees the bricks are cracked, but they are still resisting because they fundamentally don't trust the sweep's motives. They think it's just a cash grab.
Then you escalate to the second type of statement, which is alignment. Pacing establishes facts, but alignment describes a shared intent or a common desired outcome.
So you declare that you're both on the same side before they've even committed to anything?
Right. The sweep might say, I want to make sure your family stays safe and warm this winter.
And neurologically, that collapses an adversarial frame because if the homeowner pushes back against that, they look like they are fighting their own family's safety. It basically forces cooperation.
Exactly. You've aligned intents. And once you do that, you use an assumptive question.
Assumptive, meaning it assumes the sale is happening.
Kind of. It skips the decision entirely and asks about what comes after it. So, building on that safety alignment, the sweep asks, do you want us to handle replacing that rusted flashing while we're already up there reinforcing the main flue?
Sneaky.
Yeah.
You completely jumped over the if we do this and went straight to how we do this.
Yeah.
But I can see a sophisticated buyer bristling at that assumption. Let's say the homeowner is clearly stressed, arms crossed, visibly anxious about the cost. Pacing and alignment might feel too, I don't know, logical if they are emotionally blocked.
And that brings us to the third tool, resonance. This one requires you to accurately reflect the other person's internal state. It's naming the frustration or the priority that nobody else is acknowledging.
Oh, like reading the room.
Yeah. The sweep looks at the homeowner's body language and says, I know getting hit with an unexpected home repair right before the holidays is incredibly frustrating.
And the source material noted that when you do this accurately, the physical result is literal. You can literally see their shoulders drop.
Because you've proven they don't have to battle you to be understood. The fight just evaporates. And this is where you pair it with one of the most fascinating questions in the architecture. Elicitation.
Elicitation, gathering data.
Gathering data, yeah, but without feeling like an interrogation. In fact, you often don't even use a question mark.
How does that work in practice? Like, how do you ask a question without asking a question?
By using the human brain's deep-seated intolerance for unresolved silence. Direct questions can feel really extractive. They shine a spotlight on your intent.
Oh, right. They put the person on the spot.
Exactly. Elicitation is indirect. The sweep might just sigh and say, I've been trying to figure out how homeowners in this historic neighborhood usually handle the budgeting for these sudden masonry overhauls, and then just stop talking.
You just hang a statement in the air.
Yep.
And because awkward silence is physically uncomfortable, the other person feels psychologically compelled to fill the void. So they end up spilling financial data they never would have given if you had just directly asked, what's your budget?
Exactly. It's incredibly effective.
That is brilliant. But let's look at the fourth statement type, concession. Here's where it gets really interesting because this is where I actually struggle with this architecture.
Okay, why is that?
Well, concession is giving up ground or acknowledging a cost before you are forced to, right?
Right.
And in a highly competitive environment, let's take the corporate lawyers from the show Suits. But when this Suits also mentioned in the text, showing any weakness is usually treated as professional suicide. Why would admitting a flaw or giving up ground be considered a power move?
I know it seems counterintuitive, but concession fundamentally alters the other person's tactical plan. Think about those corporate lawyers. They walk into a room with a full magazine of objections ready to fire.
Yeah, they're ready for a fight.
But if you concede a point before they can attack you with it, you disarm their counterattack completely. You bypass their authority frame because you took away their ammunition.
So back to our chimney sweep. If their schedule is totally booked and their prices are premium, they don't try to hide it. They use a concession statement.
Exactly. They say, I know my schedule is incredibly tight this month, and I know this isn't a cheap fix.
Oh, and by saying that out loud, the homeowner can't use "you're too expensive" as a weapon against them.
Right. You own the flaw,
Yeah.
which actually earns you the right to ask a hard question next. You pair concession with a reframe. A reframe is like a master key. It swaps the current lens the other person is looking through entirely.
So instead of arguing about the high price, you change the definition of the money being spent.
Precisely. The sweep says, what if we look at this not just as a sudden repair expense, but as a critical investment that protects the resale value of the entire property?
Wow. Suddenly the conversation isn't about losing money at all. It's about protecting an asset.
Yeah, it completely shifts the perspective.
Okay, so we've covered pacing, alignment, resonance, and concession. That leaves the fifth, and according to the text, the sharpest tool: presupposition.
Presupposition embeds an assumption as an established, unarguable fact. The assumption just lives inside the language like a foundation under a house.
So how would the sweep use that?
The sweep might say, since the structural integrity of the chimney is our main priority.
Ah. The homeowner hasn't explicitly agreed that structural integrity is the priority, but the language presupposes it is a given.
Right. And to fight it, they would have to actively stop the conversation, back up, and explicitly challenge you, which takes a massive amount of social energy. Most people just won't do it.
That makes sense. And what question type pairs with that?
You pair a presupposition with a diagnostic question. This flips the script entirely. It puts you in the role of the evaluator. You ask, help me understand what you were hoping to get out of this inspection today.
I love that. The person showing their work is never the one holding the authority. The person asking to see the work holds the power.
Exactly.
I do have to interject here, though, because looking at this whole structure, presuppositions, reframes, using silence to extract data, this sounds a bit like we're tricking people, like we're manipulating their psychology without their consent. Is this actually ethical?
It's a really vital question. But you have to realize that this architecture runs 24 hours a day in everyone's life. Entirely organically.
It does.
Yeah. This framework comes from courses that teach NCI, meaning how to navigate non-cooperative interactions. These behavior profiling courses are about reading human behavior and intent accurately. It's not dark magic. People use these structures constantly just to manage their daily environments.
Give me an example of it happening organically, without malicious intent.
Sure. The text gives a brilliant example of a loving parent. Let's say a parent sits their teenager down after a bad decision and says, the only thing I've ever wanted in my life is what's best for you. Help me understand what you're thinking here.
Oh, wow. The only thing I've ever wanted is what's best for you is a presupposition statement. It embeds their good intent as fact.
Yep.
And help me understand what you're thinking is a diagnostic question.
Exactly. The parent isn't running a manipulative corporate playbook. They are just trying to connect and guide their kid.
I hear you, but even with the parent, framing your own good intent as an unassailable fact still takes away the teenager's ability to argue. It's effective, but I'm not sure it completely absolves the manipulator. It still kind of feels like a conversational trap.
That's a fair point. The tool itself is entirely neutral. The intent behind it is what carries the moral weight. But, whether you like the ethics of it or not, you really have to understand the mechanics, or you will constantly be subjected to them.
Okay, let's step into the real world where human interactions are messy. Let's say you deploy your perfect sequence. You use a flawless pacing statement and a directional question, and it just bounces right off the other person. They don't step into the frame. What then?
Well, the biggest mistake people make in that moment is trying harder. As the text explicitly says, trying is the opposite of having.
Oh, I like that.
If they see you visibly trying to force a frame, the game is over. You just look desperate.
It's like arguing with a brick wall. The text gave that intense clinical example, right? Trying to convince a schizophrenic patient that there are no radio signals in their teeth. If you aggressively try to pace someone whose reality is completely detached from yours, you don't convince them. You just look foolish.
Right. You cannot 10x a failing strategy.
Mm.
So if you miss, there is a strict 4-step pivot. Step 1, read the mess.
Okay.
Was the person just distracted, or did they actively reject your premise? Let's say our chimney sweep tries a pacing statement. Your bricks are spalling and dangerous. And the homeowner actively rejects it, saying, my brother-in-law looked at it yesterday and said it's totally fine for another 5 years.
Ah, so the frame bounced. The homeowner is operating a totally different reality.
Exactly. Which brings us to step 2, and this is critical. Release the frame entirely. Drop it to the universe. Do not try to defend your original statement.
So you don't argue with the brother-in-law's assessment.
Absolutely not. The moment you argue, you're fighting for a dead frame.
This makes sense. Fighting for a rejected frame just triggers the sunk cost fallacy. You just look like you're losing control of the conversation.
Precisely. So you move to step 3. Shift the class of your statement. If pacing failed, do not pace harder. Switch to a concession or a resonance statement.
Okay, so how would the sweep do that?
Instead of arguing about the bricks, the sweep shifts to concession. They say, look, I'm sure your brother-in-law knows his stuff, and the last thing I want to do is step on anyone's toes or cause family drama.
Brilliant. You conceded the ground and disarmed the conflict entirely.
And then step 4, deploy the new pairing. The sweep follows that concession with a diagnostic question. Since he already gave it a look, what was the main concern that prompted you to call a secondary service out here today?
So what does this all mean for the listener who's trying to apply this in a high-stakes meeting or a tough conversation? It tells me that the first attempt isn't actually about winning the interaction. It's kind of like a boxer throwing a light jab in the first round.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
You aren't trying to score a knockout with a jab. You just want to see how your opponent shifts their weight.
What's fascinating here is that the second attempt actually holds a massive advantage over the first.
Really? How so?
When you fail on the first try, you aren't really failing. You are merely gathering critical intelligence. You now know what the other person is protecting, what they dismiss, and how firmly they hold their frame.
Which allows your second approach to be perfectly calibrated.
Exactly. The best operators in the world rarely land the frame on the first try. They expect the bounce.
They use the bounce to map the territory. Man, this has been incredibly eye-opening. We've learned that every single conversation, from a doctor's office to a chimney repair, has an underlying architecture.
It really does.
And leaving it to chance, or relying on naked questions that surrender your power, leaves you completely at the mercy of someone else's board. But by mastering these 5 statements, pacing, alignment, resonance, concession, and presupposition, and pairing them with the right questions, you can quietly and effectively guide any interaction.
And just as importantly, using when to drop a failing frame keeps you from losing your leverage.
Absolutely.
My advice to the listener, for the next 24 hours, don't even try to use this framework. Just observe.
Just watch it happen.
Watch the people around you, your boss, your partner, the customer service rep. Watch how naturally they construct these frames without even realizing it.
Once you see the matrix, you really can't unsee it. But I want to leave you with a final lingering question to ponder. Something our sources didn't cover, but it's been bothering me.
Oh, what's that?
What happens when 2 absolute masters of frame control enter the exact same room with totally opposing goals?
Oh, wow.
Right? If both flawlessly execute these tools and both completely refuse to step into the other's frame, does the conversation just end in a complete silent stalemate? Or, in their struggle for control, do they inadvertently invent an entirely new, shared reality? Think about that next time you sit in the doctor's office.